Welcome to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset, the leading data and analytics company for the cannabis industry.
Emily, you're just back from Florida, and I gotta know, did you get a chance to check out any of the dispensaries out there, see any products? Like, what's going on with that market?
Yeah, it is pretty cool. It was great to be in Florida, great weather. There are a lot of cannabis stores, albeit they are medical, of course, as we all know. So I, being a non-Florida citizen or resident, don't have a medical card. So I went and visited our friends at Sunburn Cannabis up in Fort Lauderdale, and it was a really cool store. And it was really neat. I was browsing through their menu using remember our friend Kyla, their dispense
Of
app.
course.
So that was really cool to see it down there. And I was able to procure a rosin Mac 1 vape with proprietary tech to Sunburn. And in other words, it's a branded format that's a Sunburn vape all in one. And it's really cool. I was communicating with Brady, and they had a rosin drop on Friday, or was it Thursday? Friday, and they had an awesome day, really well responded to. And I was just saying with the guys, like, it's been cool to see the evolution of the vape category over the years, because I still remember when I got into it, like, open vape was the big huge deal at the
Oh,
time.
sure.
And yeah, and that was, liquid cut with polyethylene glycol and then coconut oil. They did all these cutting agents, but now we've got these awesome products that are like pure rosin, which, for anyone who hasn't tried it, if you're into the category, it's a really nice experience. And to see how that's already moved to Florida, I was really happy for the Florida patients who get to experience such a high quality product, because I know other markets, when they open, don't have that level of quality, but I think Florida has been a really open and accepting medical market and has really moved ahead. So you already have rosin there, and high quality, I would say. It's also one of my favorite strains. But, for example, like in California, the rosin pods for packs, which now we'll talk about is the cart method with proprietary technology, is also my favorite product of the category. So it's just neat to see how rosin's already jumping across the country.
Yeah, it is neat that these things get adopted much faster, I think, than ever before. And it's funny you mentioned open vape. I've not thought about them in a long time. And way back, a little like anecdote. They licensed Headset or Leafly's strain tiles, and it was kind of
Oh,
weird. You'd see the colors, the purple, green, and orange open vape colors, and then they
yeah.
started using the strain tiles, and I think they like came with a magnet that had the strain tile. But it was kind of a cool for us early days of Leafly, and kind of seeing that adoption of like the periodic table of elements that we had produced for the different strains, and then some organizations jumping on that, particularly for a category that was new and emerging, and pretty cool. So that's funny. I hadn't thought about them in a in a little while, because now, I mean, the vape pen world is massive and very diverse, in a long way from that. And this is all covered in a recent report that we published at Headset, and I know we want to talk about this today and cover this today. It's been a little while since we've kind of done a deep dive on vapor pens, so we'll certainly put a link in the show notes so you guys can all go and download the report yourselves. But yeah, there's a lot in here, so let's dig into it. Where do you want to start?
Well, I think we should start with some of the key punch points here. Like, for example, I think it's important to know, I mean, this is a large category, and the category did take a hit back in 2019 when Vapegate occurred, which it's important to note that that was illicit market product that was substantially driving the concerns around the market. And it was a good validation for our legal market, because the legal tested products were not part of the problem. So, fast forward to today, and the data set from this goes from January 21 through December 22. So it gives you a nice snapshot to see how this category has evolved in the time kind of post the wild recovery from Vapegate, which was really difficult for the industry to come through. And I know multiple companies that didn't even really make it through that time. And then through also the wild gyration of what we all know happened during the pandemic. And so starting in January 2021, even though still in the throes of the pandemic, but here we go. So, in Canada, what is it? In Canada, it's the second largest category in the market.
Third largest category,
Third in Canada, and
second
second
in the
in the
U.S.
United States.
That's
And
right.
and so it's 17% of the overall market in Canada and 23.6% in the US market. So these are pretty big categories. But what I also thought was interesting is that they're growing again.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. And they seem to grow kind of differently in different markets. The Canada, it is interesting that that Canada it's number 3, but it does vary by province. And that's
Hmm.
like a kind of a unique, I don't know, the thing that's so unique about Canada versus US markets is that, in Canada you can distribute across provinces, right? Because it's
Hmm.
federally legal. And so there's, cross province commerce. So a brand can be produced in Ontario and sold in Saskatchewan. And in Canada, it's Saskatchewan. Vape pens are actually pretty popular. 23.5% of total sales last year, which is 57% higher than the 15% of total sales captured in BC. So, I don't have the data here in front of me to kind of dig into that, but it could be the consumer profile could be slightly different, but most likely it's like the brand availability and like what's actually in Saskatchewan versus BC, um even though you can distribute across, right? There's still distribution, and maybe not a lot of operators are distributing in Saskatchewan. Maybe BC with its history in cannabis is just a little more old school with flower and pre-roll. Like, there's all sorts of assumptions we can make, but it is interesting to see those differences and being so wildly different, especially given, Canada legalized at the same time.
Hmm.
The provinces obviously have different structures and they rolled out differently, but it's different than saying Washington versus I don't know, New York right now, right? Where Washington came online so many years ago, and New York is just now coming online. Where you could expect some big differences, 60% difference between the states, because the states have been around for so much a different time frame. So the Canada stuff is pretty unique, and would be something interesting to kind of look into more. But you did mention growth, and when we look
Yeah.
at growth, um, vapor pens are growing in market share, well, sales and market share, category share, in a big way in the legacy markets, right? So in some of the older markets like Washington, like Colorado, um, Oregon, in Colorado, looks like vape pen grew 27%, Nevada about 25%, Washington 23%, Oregon 18%. In our numbers here. So those are significantly higher growth rates than other markets. And I would assume that is because I don't know, when they legalized vapor pen was still pretty new. Where you look at some newer markets coming in, like your point about Florida, they're already getting rosin there. It's quick. And so like if a market turns on tomorrow, rosin's probably already part of the market shares. So it's not going to grow as much as a market that doesn't have that, and now it's coming in, and you're starting to see that take market share. So it is interesting to see the growth here, for sure.
I thought that growth in those markets where we've seen stagnant to down year over year around that same time is just really interesting, and I think it just shows that the category is starting to have some different stickiness and resonance. And yeah, maybe it's growing off of some artificial decline, such as because of vape gay, but vape is back, baby. It's coming back around. It's cool.
It is cool, and it's cool because it seems to resonate with the Gen Z consumer. So
Let the kids vape. I mean, the kids that are above 21, of
21 and
course.
older.
Hey, people still call me a kid, and I'm like twice that old, so
Tw-
you
Twice that old. Come on. Um, so the whole Gen Z like totally over index, and I'm pulling up the data here while we're talking about it, and it's pretty surprising. So index to category, and the way you think about this is if the index is greater than 100, then that group spends relatively more on a category than they do on other categories. So like while the dollar sales, when you put everybody into a pool, and there's some Gen Z, and there's some millennials, and there's some Gen X and baby boomers, um, maybe Gen Z is spending less. They have less purchasing power. They're a smaller subset that, a few years of age, buying cannabis versus millennials, where you have the broader age. But when you look at like how they spend their money, they spend way more on vapor pens. So, if you just look at the pie chart of like Gen Z versus millennials and others, sure, they're going to come in, a little less than like a millennial, but they do spend more. And as they age in, right, and continue, and more people come into the category, I think that's just going to naturally show like more growth of vapor pen, unless there's something that happens at a certain age where you just fall off of the category. But I don't think that's true when you look at how well millennials index there currently. So I think it's like a precursor to like growth, right? Because this is the category that's going to grow. This is why people love to target young people, marketers, products, and just
know.
everything, right? Because that they're going to grow, and you want your brand to grow with them, and capture them as a consumer. And so seeing that they're over indexed significantly really does I don't know, show that this is a category that isn't going anywhere anytime soon.
I think you're spot on. And I think that a lot of it can be also credited to the new technology. So, we were talking about open vape, like good for them. They were the first through pioneers on this category. Absolutely. But we've come further than just 510 thread. But I mean, 510 thread is still a predominant form factor, and those carts are everywhere. And that's fantastic because it's a known form factor. People are comfortable with it. It's easy to switch it in and out. But then you have some of the proprietary technology like the PAX era or the Steezy platform. And yeah, these are platforms. And what's nice about it is it does, for example, rosin can be a higher dose product. But if you use a technology device that's kind of a smart or enabled device, you can set the settings so you can have a different experience. So, like the person next to me, who might be the person who's looking for a very big and heavy hit, would use a different setting than I would. And I think that's actually really important. And I think that the younger generations do have an expectation that they will have personalized experiences. I see this in every consumer category. And so I think this is very relevant there. And then the other thing I was going to say about that, I think there's a couple of things. When I think about vape, a lot of women I know like it for the fact that it's discreet. And so it kind of sidesteps some of the stigma around, smoking pot. I mean, I really enjoy a pre-roll, but I'm also obviously in the business and I'm very comfortable with cannabis. But, I think vape is really great for that. I also do think the technology looks really cool, and it's kind of that's where technology and branding start to intersect, is where it reflects you. I mean, think about our devices. iPhone iPhone looked a certain way. Let's face it, that was a critical piece. And Steve Jobs was first to really not the first, but among the first to really zero in on that it has to look a certain way to reflect a certain aesthetic and have a user experience that you don't have to work hard for. And I think these devices are starting to get there, and that's really exciting for us. I do wonder too, though, I know there's a pretty high number of Gen Z that are living at home, and I wonder if that discrete nature. I know also though with boomer parents or later or earlier Gen X parents, there may be more openness to consuming cannabis. I don't know what the bridge on that is yet, but maybe there is a little bit about of the discretion around consuming when you're living at home. I
Yeah,
don't know.
yeah, and the younger generation, I don't know, has been more exposed to just vape in general,
Yep,
for for better for worse, right? Um, in other categories, and so it's a easy jump across, I think, than
that's a good
smoking.
point.
Yeah, which is probably still probably better for you. I mean, depending on what the vape is, but there is that, right? They're used to that, so I'm sure that's where it's coming from a bit. But your point about the hardware and the tech, we were talking last week about pricing and its impact on markets and some of the sales numbers that we're seeing coming out of states now that the year is closed out and you're starting to see states reporting data, and pricing and vape hasn't been immune. uh there's a lot of things like beyond pricing. Product introductions are down. SKUs are kind of pulling back a little bit. um you know they're definitely, the average item price is going down and equivalized price is going down. Equivalized price is that per gram price.
Yep.
Average item price is just the average of all the different product types, from disposable to cartridge to whatever
Mm-hmm.
is in the vape category. But when you look at even just like the per gram equivalized across, it is declining quite a bit towards the tail end of the year. It looks like the curve's flattening out. When we look at the data, um, in Canada, in the US, it's pretty steep and still declining. But I think that if any category has an opportunity to kind of separate itself in a meaningful way, I think vape is a good one, um, because of the potential proprietary nature of
Mm-hmm.
the vape hardware. And certainly you see brands that are having some success with that. There are a lot of the 510 thread, the kind of the standard out there. That's probably harder to
Mm-hmm.
differentiate against, right? Where maybe just differentiate by having the rosin over the live resin or the distillate or certain strains. But
Mm-hmm.
often it's like price point, right? People are looking at like distillate for potency numbers and price point, right? And not that I'm saying that's the right way to shop by any means, but it seems to, I mean, that's probably a lot of what people are purchasing on. And then, so that's a little harder to separate there, right? Because you're just a distillate at that point, which is just like an extraction. And it really just does come down to, well, what's going to be cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
Where if it's like a maybe something a little more proprietary, like in a 510 thread, then you might have some advantages. But when I think about the unique hardware, like the PAX eras, things like that, where you're invested in the device, well, now you're shopping from a smaller pool of products.
Mm-hmm.
And one, you're loyal to kind of that group. You're not going to, most likely you're not going to jump out of that. And we see that in the data too, and the brand retention data for some of these companies, that it just is a natural thing. Like you come back and you buy more because you've bought the hardware, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that when you think about price pressure, it seems like you're a little more immune to that if you are able to build that customer retention and get them locked in with the platform.
Mm-hmm.
um and then they don't go anywhere. And back to your Apple, it's like, how often do you see people switch from an iPhone to an Android? It's pretty rare, right? Because not because an Android came out with a cheaper phone, or maybe has better camera, or it's faster. I mean, there's on all sorts of metrics, like an Android is better, can be better. But you're locked into the ecosystem, right? Like, if you use a Mac and you have an iPhone and you're on, like, you have your photos up in iCloud and you're using the App Store, like, you're locked in, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so the next iPhone can come out, and maybe choose not to upgrade, but you're not going to leave iPhone. And so same thing with this proprietary hardware. I think there's an advantage there on the pricing, to really differentiate. And edibles maybe is another category that's similar, but edibles is still like, a gummy versus a gummy. It's like, well, which one's cheaper, right? Like, even if one maybe tastes a little better, it's like, it's still harder. But if you can get someone bought in to your ecosystem as a proprietary vape pen, like, I feel like that is a bit of a shield versus this price compression. But I don't know. When you look at this report, you can see it's still, there's a lot of price compression. And there's really not that many brands that are doing proprietary devices. And even the PAX era, once you're in that ecosystem, you're purchasing from a variety of brands, right? That license the pods. And so those brands are going to be competitive amongst themselves. But it does seem like a good way to protect yourself. But obviously, the hard part is getting people bought into the ecosystem, right? Like, why are they going to choose that pin over another pin?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I think it then if you go that path, then you have to continue to surprise and delight your customer, because it's like that, that which nourishes you destroys you. If you get them into the ecosystem, but then you don't launch new products or services, then they stop buying within your ecosystem. But it is interesting to think about how these different platforms have been different, like levers for brands. Like, for example, Jetty extracts, very early on, they've always had a 510 thread or their own version of what a 510 thread product would be like in the carts. But they also did a partnership with PAX to be one of their pod providers in California. And I think it was a really smart move. And I know groups in Colorado and Oregon have done this, and now PAX has their own pods. But it's just a really interesting again, it's a really interesting platform for both things. So you can have your own, you can have others, and it creates variety, which is the spice of life and also the way to keep consumers engaged.
Do you know, has PAX moved strictly to their own now, or do they still license it like they used to Jetty and others?
uh, they still license
Mm.
it, because I think, when you have good partners, I think it's a great way to continue to pursue the market. But to your point about price discovery or price compression in the markets on this particular category, I mean, everyone, I urge you to check out the report, because the charts are pretty interesting to see. And I do think we're in price discovery mode. I mean, I know we just had a whole talk about pricing in the last episode of the podcast, and it was interesting because we did that, and then GTI had their Q4 earnings call, and one of the biggest things they talked about was price. And I think on top of that, then when I was in Florida, there's a whole conversation about pricing and promotion and premiumization. And we are just constantly on a journey in this industry, because we're still an emerging market and we're still trying to figure out, how we can address the consumers that are the spendiest, and then also broaden the bell curve so we can bring in new audiences, and maybe the new audiences we can attract will be less price sensitive, perhaps, and doing, for example, in the price per gram calculation, and just more interested in some other components or factors that drive their purchase decision.
Yeah, yeah. The story is certainly, not written quite yet, but it is kind of fun to watch. I mean, things are changing. Brand count increased over the last 3 years. Unsurprising, new markets, more brands, but it's increased at a much slower rate. Some other highlights in here that we reported on: product count has gone down, distinct products by month. So it looks like brands are pulling back from such a proliferation of SKUs, which is probably good for the consumer too. um
Yes.
it's just
Just
overwhelming,
to
right? Yeah.
overwhelming. And I think what would be really interesting is to overlay this data with what's gone on in, for example, the gummy space,
Hmm.
because I feel like there's so many groups jumping in on gummies, or it's just an interesting thing to see how these different categories arc in terms of brands and SKUs, and then the culling and the narrowing in on what's gaining traction. So really interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I encourage everyone to check it out. Um, and I separately, I looked up a little bit of this. You're mentioning rosin and how it's doing in California. It's the third most popular. Looking at like the last 90 days of sales,
Mhm.
it's about 10% of the distillate and 10% of the live resin. Those in the last 90 days did about 75 million. Rosin did about 7 million. So a little ways to go,
Wow.
but it grew year over year, 162%. So it is like I think you're ahead of something, which is, you know, unsurprising. There
Tastemaker.
you go. And speaking of pricing, last week we did talk a ton about what was going on in California, and frankly, most markets right now. And one of the things that we called out was the cannabis deserts, and kind of a map of where that might be. And Nicole Elliott, the director of cannabis control of California, mentioned that they actually do have a map, and we'll put a link in the show notes to that map. But it's really pretty helpful to be able to see exactly where the coverage is, and where the coverage is not. And it does look like the state's got a little ways to go. So right now when I'm looking at it, it says 44% allow, cities and counties allow at least one cannabis business type, and 56% prohibit. Cities and counties prohibit all cannabis business types. And there's some big counties in here, like San Bernardino County. So anyways, I encourage everyone to take a look, because it really does give you context of like what's going on in California. California's a big state, right? Big population, and not every city, not every county is equal, and it's a good way to look at it. So shout out to Nicole for sending that along, and for making that available to everybody. So definitely take a look, and I'm sure there'll be plenty more to talk about with pricing and California and all the other markets in the months ahead here.
Thanks for listening to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset. For more information on Headset, visit headset.io.